call came on a Tuesday night, a crack of thunder in the quiet hum of my Seattle apartment. It was a prelude to a 200-mile drive through a nightmare of freezing rain and slick, black asphalt. A drive that ended with me finding my mother, a woman I hadn't spoken to in 5 years, shivering in the hollow, fluorescent glare of a deserted rest stop. My brother, the golden son, and his perfect wife had done this. They had shattered her, stripped her of her dignity, and left her on the side of the road like a piece of trash. In that moment, watching her tremble, something shifted inside me. It wasn't just about saving her anymore. It was about dismantling the perfect world they had built on her suffering. Before I tell you how I did it, I need to know that you're with me on this. Just type "I'm here" in the comments, or let me know what city you're listening from. Knowing this story is being heard makes all the difference. Thank you for that, and please, consider subscribing. Your support helps bring stories like this out of the shadows. My name is Liam Connor, and for a living, I tell other people's stories. As a documentary filmmaker, I'm supposed to be an observer, a man who finds the truth in the shadows and brings it to the light. But for the last 5 years, I'd been ignoring the biggest shadow in my own life, my family. The call that changed everything came at 11:47 p.m. I was surrounded by takeout containers and editing notes, the blue light of my monitors painting my face. The number was from an Oregon area code I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail, but some strange, primal instinct made me answer. The voice on the other end was flat, stripped of all emotion. "Are you Liam Connor?" When I said yes, he continued, "This is Deputy Miller with the Clackamas County Sheriff's Office. Sir, we found your mother, Evelyn Connor. She's disoriented. She was located at the Eagle Creek Rest Area off I-84. She's refusing medical attention, but she gave us your name." My blood ran cold. He didn't say she was hurt. He didn't say she was in danger. But the word he used, "found," was the kind of word you use for something that was lost, abandoned. I didn't ask questions. I didn't pack a bag. I just moved. I pulled on a heavy coat over my sweatshirt, grabbed my wallet and keys, and walked out of my apartment, leaving the lights and the computer on, a ghost image of a life that had been interrupted. The drive south on I-5 was a descent into a special kind of hell. The Seattle rain turned to sleet, then to a relentless, freezing rain that lacquered the highway in a sheet of invisible ice. The windshield wipers screeched, fighting a losing battle, their rhythm a frantic metronome counting down to what? Twice, the SUV's tires broke loose, the back end fishtailing toward the guardrail with a sickening lurch. Both times, I wrestled it back under control, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, my heart hammering against my ribs. To distract myself, I tried to turn on a podcast, but the host's cheerful voice felt like an insult. I switched to music, but the lyrics felt hollow. The only sound was the percussive tick-tick-tick of ice against glass and the roar of the engine. The drive became a tunnel, and in that roaring darkness, the memories I had so carefully buried began to surface. The last time I'd spoken to my mother, 5 years ago, was on a phone call that had burned every bridge between us. I had discovered that my brother, Caleb, the charismatic real estate mogul, had built his first major development by strong-arming elderly homeowners into selling their properties for pennies on the dollar. It was predatory, it was disgusting, and when I confronted my mother with the proof, she didn't just defend him, she chose him. "You've always been jealous of his ambition," she'd said, her voice sharp with a disappointment that cut deeper than any anger. "Caleb provides for this family. He builds things. All you do is criticize from the sidelines with your little camera." "He's a vulture, Mom," I had pleaded, my voice cracking. "He's destroying lives." "He is my son," she'd answered, and the finality in her tone was like a door slamming shut in my face. "And if you can't support him, then maybe you need to think about what family really means." I hung up, and I didn't call back. Not for birthdays, not for holidays, not for 5 years. I had chosen my integrity. She had chosen her golden child. Now, as the green glow of a sign announced I was 10 miles from the Eagle Creek exit, a terrible thought coiled in my stomach. What if she was in trouble because of him? What if the predator she had defended for so long had finally turned on her? The dread was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe as I took the exit ramp, my headlights cutting through the icy darkness toward whatever waited for me. The Eagle Creek Rest Area was a pocket of harsh, unnatural light in the oppressive darkness of the Columbia River Gorge. Freezing rain fell in sheets, glazing the empty parking lot and the skeletal trees with a shimmering layer of ice. It was a desolate, forgotten place, the kind of spot you only stop at when you have no other choice. I pulled in, my tires crunching on the salted asphalt, and for a moment I saw nothing but the wind whipping rain across the beams of my headlights. Then I saw him, a lone sheriff's cruiser, parked near the public restrooms, its light bar dark, and next to it, a small, huddled figure. My heart seized. It was her. Even from 50 yards away, I knew. She was sitting on a concrete bench under the weak buzz of a flickering overhead light, wrapped in a thin blanket that looked pitifully inadequate against the biting cold. I put the SUV in park and got out, the icy wind hitting me like a physical blow. As I got closer, the horror of the scene came into sharp focus. The blanket was a standard-issue police blanket, and beneath it, her feet were bare. They were red and raw against the frozen concrete, a sight so wrong, so utterly unthinkable, that my mind struggled to process it. Her face was pale, her lips tinged with blue, and a deep, ugly bruise was blooming in the hollow of her cheek, a dark plum color against her ashen skin. Her eyes, the same eyes that had once shone with fierce intelligence and stubborn pride, were vacant and unfocused. She was staring at something far beyond the rain-swept parking lot. "Mom?" I said, my voice catching, sounding foreign and rough in the cold air. She flinched, her gaze snapping toward me. There was no recognition in her eyes at first, only pure, animal fear. Then, a flicker of awareness. "Liam?" she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. What are you doing here?" I knelt in front of her, ignoring the icy slush soaking through the knee of my jeans. Deputy Miller called me. "Mom, what happened? Where are your shoes? Your coat?" "Oh," she said, looking down at her bare feet as if noticing them for the first time. I must have left them. I was in such a hurry." She shook her head, a quick, jerky motion. "I just slipped, honey. The porch steps were slick with ice, so clumsy of me." I got turned around trying to find the urgent care. Her words tumbled out, rehearsed and brittle, a pathetic lie that neither of us believed. Every instinct I had, every skill I'd honed as a storyteller who dissects truth from fiction, screamed that she was reciting a script someone else had written for her. Just then, the deputy got out of his cruiser and walked toward us. He was young, with a serious face that looked tired and etched with concern. "Mr. Connor," he said, nodding to me. "I'm Deputy Miller. Glad you could make it." His eyes flicked to my mother, his expression softening with pity before hardening again. He lowered his voice, speaking to me directly. "Her story doesn't quite add up. We got a call from a trucker who saw her wandering near the on-ramp, said she looked like she'd seen a ghost. When we got here, she was trying to hide behind the vending machines." He paused, letting the words sink in. "The bruise on her face doesn't look like it came from a fall, and she refuses to tell us where she was coming from or who she was with." I looked from the deputy's grim face back to my mother's terrified one. She was clutching the blanket so tightly her knuckles were white, her gaze fixed on the ground, refusing to look at either of us. She was trapped in a prison of fear, protecting the very person who had put her there. The anger that had been simmering in my chest during the entire drive began to sharpen into a cold, hard point. This wasn't just neglect, this was cruelty. This was a message. "I've got it from here, deputy," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Thank you for finding her. Thank you for calling me." I helped my mother to her feet. She was shockingly light, fragile as a bird, and she leaned on me heavily as we walked toward my SUV. The warmth of the car's heater blasted us as I opened the passenger door, a stark contrast to the bitter cold she'd been enduring for God knows how long. I settled her into the seat, buckled her seatbelt like she was a child, and shut the door on the roaring wind. As I walked around to the driver's side, Deputy Miller caught my arm. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, his eyes meeting mine. "People don't just get lost and end up like this. Whatever's going on, son, don't let it go." I just nodded, got in the car, and pulled out of the rest stop, leaving the lonely glow of the deputy's cruiser behind us in the rearview mirror. My mother sat in the passenger seat, silent and shivering, staring out at the black, icy world as if the monster she was running from was still out there, hiding in the rain. The drive to the nearest town was only 10 minutes, but the silence in the car was heavy and suffocating, thick with 5 years of unspoken words. Evelyn just stared out the window, her reflection a ghostly mask in the glass. I found the first motel I could, a place called the Pine View Inn, whose flickering neon sign promised more than the peeling paint and rust-stained fixtures delivered. It was the perfect place to be anonymous. I paid cash for a room with 2 beds, the night clerk barely looking up from his crossword puzzle. The room itself was a study in beige and brown, smelling faintly of stale cigarette smoke and desperation. It was a place where stories ended, not where they began. But for us, it was a sanctuary, a temporary pause button on the chaos. I sat her down on the edge of one of the stiffly made beds and went into the bathroom to soak a washcloth in warm water. When I came back, she hadn't moved. She looked like a porcelain doll that had been dropped, all the life and color shattered out of her. "Let me see your face," I said softly, kneeling in front of her again. She flinched when I gently touched her chin, but she let me turn her head toward the dim lamplight. The bruise on her cheek was even darker now, and I could see a small, clean cut on her lip. As I carefully dabbed at the blood, my fingers brushed against her wrist. She winced, pulling back. I gently took her arm and pushed the sleeve of her thin cardigan up. Dark, mottled bruises circled her upper arm, ugly splotches of purple and blue in the unmistakable shape of fingers. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't from a fall. This was the mark of someone who had been grabbed, held down, controlled. "Mom," I said, my voice low and tight with a fury I was struggling to contain. "Who did this to you?" Tears welled in her eyes, glassy and unshed. "He was just so angry," she began, her voice a fragile whisper. For a split second, I thought the dam was about to break. I saw a crack in the facade, a glimpse of the truth. But then, as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, sealed back up by a lifetime of fear. "He was so angry that I wasn't listening," she corrected herself, her words frantic. "Caleb was just trying to explain the finances, and I got confused. I stumbled on the rug, and he grabbed my arm to stop me from falling. It was my fault, Liam. I made him upset. You know how he gets a temper when he's stressed." The lie was so blatant, so pathetic, it was almost worse than the truth. She was building a cage of excuses around herself, and she was handing my brother the key. The frustration was a hot poker in my gut. I wanted to shake her, to scream at her, to force her to see the reality of what was happening. But I looked at her trembling hands and the hollowed-out fear in her eyes, and I knew it would be like shouting at a cornered animal. It would only drive her deeper into her hole. So I just nodded, finished cleaning her lip, and pulled a thick blanket from the other bed, draping it around her shoulders. "Get some rest," I said, my voice strained. She curled up on her side without another word, pulling the blanket tight, and within minutes she was lost in a shallow, exhausted sleep, her breathing punctuated by tiny, whimpering sounds. I stood there for a long time, just watching her, feeling a million miles away from the life I'd been living only a few hours ago. The woman sleeping on the bed was a stranger, a ghost of the sharp, formidable mother I remembered. Needing to do something, anything, I picked up her thin, damp coat from the floor. I figured I should check the pockets for an ID or keys. The first pocket was empty. In the second, my fingers closed around a crumpled, flimsy piece of paper. It wasn't a receipt. It was a napkin, the cheap, thin kind you get from a diner. I smoothed it out under the lamp. Scrawled in my mother's familiar, looping handwriting were 4 words that made the air in my lungs turn to ice. Grimaldi Law, Trust Amendment. I stared at the words, reading them over and over. Grimaldi, I didn't know the name. But Trust Amendment, that wasn't about a slip and fall. That wasn't about a momentary loss of temper. That was about money. That was about legal documents. That was premeditated. This napkin was a breadcrumb, a clue she must have scribbled in a moment of frantic clarity. It was the first solid thing I could hold on to in a room full of lies, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that my mother hadn't just been pushed. She was being systematically dismantled. The first hint of a weak gray dawn was filtering through the motel room's thin curtains when I finally stopped staring at the napkin. Grimaldi Law, Trust Amendment. The words were a key, but I had no idea what lock they fit. My mother was still lost in a restless sleep, her face a mask of exhaustion. I knew with absolute certainty that I couldn't get the truth from her, not yet. She wasn't a witness, she was a hostage, and her captor lived inside her head. To get answers, I had to go to the source. I had to go home. I wrote a quick note, Mom. Went to get us some food. Be back soon. Don't open the door for anyone. And left it on the nightstand where she would see it if she woke up. Then I slipped out into the brittle, post-storm morning. The 20-minute drive to my childhood home was surreal. The ice storm had passed, leaving behind a world encased in glass. Tree branches drooped, heavy and sparkling, and the roads were eerily quiet. It was beautiful, but it was the kind of sharp, cold beauty that could kill you. My old neighborhood looked the same, the familiar houses and manicured lawns of my youth now looking like a pristine, frozen movie set. I parked my SUV 2 blocks away and walked the rest, my breath pluming in the frigid air. The house stood exactly as I remembered it, a handsome 2-story colonial at the end of a cul-de-sac. But as I got closer, I felt a creeping sense of dread. It felt wrong, impersonal. I circled around to the back, my feet crunching on the icy grass. My heart hammered in my chest as I reached for the fake rock by the back patio, the one we'd all used for decades. I half expected it to be gone, another piece of the past discarded. But my fingers found it, cold and solid. I turned it over, and there, nestled in the hollow, was a spare key. A small, stupid surge of relief washed over me before being replaced by a cold reality. They hadn't moved the key because they never, in a million years, expected me to come back. I was so irrelevant that I wasn't even considered a threat. I slipped the key into the lock, turned it, and stepped inside. The first thing that hit me was the smell. It wasn't the familiar scent of my mother's baking or the faint, pleasant dustiness of old books. It smelled sterile, like bleach and a cloying chemical lemon air freshener. The air was still and cold. The second thing I noticed was the silence. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was an empty, hollow silence that absorbed all sound. I walked into the living room, my boots feeling clumsy and loud on the hardwood floors. The furniture was the same, but it had been rearranged into a stiff, formal layout that felt more like a hotel lobby than a family room. On the mantel above the fireplace, where a chaotic collage of family photos used to sit, there were now just 3 perfectly spaced, silver-framed portraits. One of Caleb and Morgan on their wedding day, one of their daughter, Chloe, smiling with a gap in her teeth, and one of the 3 of them at some charity gala, looking wealthy and untouchable. My blood ran cold. The picture of us at the Grand Canyon, the one where I was 12 and making rabbit ears behind Caleb's head, was gone. The photo of my mom holding me on my first day of school was gone. Every trace of me had been scrubbed clean. I moved into the main hallway, where the long wall had served as our family's historical record. It was now a shrine to Caleb. Caleb accepting an award, Caleb and Morgan cutting a ribbon, Chloe at her ballet recital. I walked closer, my eyes scanning the frames, and then I saw it. A group photo from a family reunion years ago. I remembered that day. I'd been standing on the end, next to my mom, but now the photo ended with her. The right side of the image was just gone. It hadn't been reframed. It looked like it had been taken out, and someone had used a paper cutter to slice my entire existence right off the edge before putting it back. It was a violation so profound, so chillingly deliberate, it stole the air from my lungs. This wasn't just forgetting me. This was a systematic, meticulous campaign of erasure. I wasn't just the estranged son. I was the redacted chapter, the part of the story they had decided to rip out and burn. My sadness curdled into a cold, hard resolve. I pulled out my phone. My hands were shaking, but I forced them steady. I started at the mantel and worked my way down the hall, my filmmaker's instincts taking over. I wasn't a son anymore. I was an archivist documenting a crime scene. I took a photo of each new portrait, each empty space, each cruelly edited memory. This was evidence. This was proof of their intent. As I was photographing the last frame, a faint sound from upstairs made me freeze, a soft, rhythmic creak, like a rocking chair in motion. Someone was home. I stood frozen in the hallway, my own breathing roaring in my ears. The sound from upstairs, that soft, rhythmic creak, had stopped the moment I'd frozen. Every nerve in my body screamed that Caleb or Morgan was up there, listening, waiting. I held my breath, straining to hear anything else. A footstep, a cough, a whisper, nothing. Only the low hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen and the frantic thumping of my own heart. After what felt like an eternity, the sound came again, a gentle, melodic chime. It wasn't a rocking chair. It was a wind-up mobile, the kind you hang over a baby's crib. My niece, Chloe. They must have moved her old one into a guest room. It was probably just the end of its cycle. I was alone. The wave of relief that washed over me was so intense it left me feeling weak, but it was quickly replaced by a renewed sense of urgency. I had what I came for. It was time to go. I retraced my steps, moving silently toward the back door, my eyes scanning everything one last time, and that's when I saw it. On a bookshelf crowded with my brother's business awards and Morgan's pristine art books, there was a small matte black cube, no bigger than a sugar cube. It was disguised to look like a smart home gadget or a high-end air freshener. But as a filmmaker, I'm obsessed with lenses, and from the corner of my eye, I caught the telltale tiny glint of coated glass. My blood turned to ice. It was a camera. And it wasn't pointed at the entryway for security. It was angled specifically toward the worn, leather armchair in the corner of the room, the chair that had been my mother's favorite for 30 years. The place where she read, drank her tea, and talked on the phone. They weren't watching their house. They were watching her. My mind raced. A hidden camera was a disgusting invasion of privacy, but it was also a potential witness. A silent, perfect witness that couldn't be intimidated or gaslit. I glanced toward the stairs, my heart pounding again. I had to get the footage. I walked over to the bookshelf, my movements slow and deliberate. I picked up a heavy art book and pretended to inspect it, using its cover to shield my hands as I fumbled with the tiny device. I found the slot on the side and used my thumbnail to press it. A tiny micro SD card popped out. My fingers, clumsy with adrenaline, almost dropped it. I quickly pocketed the card, slid the hollow device back into its place, and walked out the back door without looking back, locking it behind me. The drive back to the motel was a blur. The small memory card in my pocket felt as heavy as a brick, a tiny square of plastic that could either be nothing or could be everything. I found my mother still asleep, though she'd tossed in the night, the blanket now pooled around her waist. The room was stuffy and quiet. I sat on the edge of the other bed, pulled out my laptop, and slid the card into the adapter. My hands were shaking. Dozens of video files appeared on the screen, labeled only with dates and times. Most were hours long, showing nothing but an empty room, days of silence. I started scrubbing through the most recent files, my eyes glued to the screen. And then I found it, a file dated yesterday evening. The timestamp read 8:12 p.m. My breath hitched. I pressed play. The image was grainy, but the sound was shockingly clear. There was my mother, sitting in her armchair, looking small and frail. Caleb stood over her, his large frame casting a shadow. Morgan was perched on the arm of the sofa, watching like a hawk. Caleb slid a sheaf of papers and a pen onto the end table beside her. "It's all standard, Mother," Caleb's voice said, a smooth, condescending baritone. "Just sign it. It's for your own good. It protects your assets." "I don't understand all this legal language, Caleb." My mother's voice trembled, but there was a core of defiance in it. "I want to talk to a lawyer. The napkin, I want to call Mr. Grimaldi." Caleb's smile vanished. "We are not calling anyone. You will sign this tonight." "No," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but it was there. "Number." What happened next was so fast, so brutal, I almost didn't process it. Caleb's hand, an open palm, whipped across her face. The sound was a sharp, sickening crack that echoed in the silent motel room. My mother's head snapped to the side, and she crumpled, letting out a pained cry as her head struck the wooden arm of the chair. I felt a guttural rage rise in me, so powerful it made me dizzy. But what I saw next was somehow even more horrifying. As Caleb stood back, breathing heavily, Morgan slid off the sofa. She walked calmly toward the camera, her expression utterly blank. She reached out a manicured hand and tilted the camera down just a few degrees, perfecting the angle, ensuring it captured my mother's slumped, sobbing form more clearly. Then, without a word, she turned and walked out of the frame. It wasn't just complicity, it was production. She was directing their little horror movie. The air left my lungs. I was no longer an observer. I was a witness to the undeniable, objective truth. This wasn't a family dispute. This was a crime. The bruises, the lies, the fear, the trust amendment, it all slammed into place. With trembling fingers, I dragged the file to my desktop. I renamed it Evidence 01. I immediately started uploading it to my secure cloud server. Then I made a second copy on a separate hard drive. My grief and shock were being consumed by a cold, clarifying fury. They had filmed their own monstrous act. And now, I was going to make sure it was the last thing the world ever saw of them. I sat in the buzzing silence of the motel room for what felt like an hour, the horrifying loop of the video playing over and over in my mind. The image of Morgan's blank face as she adjusted the camera was burned onto the back of my eyelids. My initial, explosive rage had cooled, settling into something far more dangerous, a cold, dense, and absolute certainty. This was not a family drama, this was a hunt. But my first priority was still the woman sleeping a few feet away. She would wake up soon, and when she did, she would be disoriented and scared in this strange, grimy room. She would need her things. Her medication from the bathroom cabinet, her reading glasses, a change of clothes, small comforts of a life that had been ripped away from her. The thought of her waking up with nothing solidified my resolve. I had to go back. This time, not as a thief in the shadows, but as her son. I drove back to the house, but this time I didn't park down the street. I pulled right into the driveway, the crunch of my tires on the icy asphalt sounding like a declaration of war. I used the key in the front door, walked in, and called out into the cavernous silence. "I'm here for my mother's things." There was a pause, and then the soft patter of footsteps. Morgan appeared at the top of the stairs, a vision of casual elegance in a cream-colored cashmere sweatsuit. She wasn't surprised. She wasn't angry. A slow, serene smile spread across her face, a smile that didn't touch her eyes. It was a smile like a blade, polished and sharp. "Liam," she said, her voice a smooth, melodic purr as she descended the stairs. "We were wondering when you'd finally show up." Caleb was so worried when he heard about Mother's little accident. A nasty fall. You know how clumsy she can be. The lie was so effortless, so practiced, it was almost admirable. She stood before me in the sterile foyer of the home she had stolen, feigning concern for the woman she had watched get assaulted less than 24 hours ago. My hands clenched into fists in my coat pockets, but I kept my face impassive. "I need her blood pressure medication from the upstairs bathroom, and some clothes." "Of course," she said, gesturing gracefully toward the stairs, as if granting me permission in my own home. "Help yourself." "I'm just surprised she called you. After all this time, she must be very confused." Her eyes, a pale, calculating blue, scanned my face, probing for a reaction, trying to gauge how much I knew, how much of a problem I was going to be. She was testing the waters. I didn't give her the satisfaction. I just nodded and walked past her up the stairs, the scent of her expensive perfume lingering in the air. I went into my mother's bedroom, a room that, unlike the rest of the house, still felt a little like her. The scent of lavender hung in the air, and a well-worn book was face down on the nightstand. I moved quickly, a man on a mission, grabbing the pill bottles from the medicine cabinet, a few sweaters, a pair of comfortable pants. I packed them all into a small overnight bag I found in her closet. The entire time I could feel Morgan's presence downstairs, a cold weight in the otherwise empty house. When I came back down, she was in the kitchen, leaning against a pristine white marble countertop, sipping a glass of water. She watched me walk toward the door, a look of pitying amusement on her face. "You know, Liam," she said, her voice dropping into a more confidential, conspiratorial tone, "you look so much like your father. He was always trying to save people who didn't want to be saved." She took a delicate sip of water. It's a noble impulse, but it rarely ends well. Some things are better left buried, for everyone's sake. It was a threat, delivered as a piece of friendly, sisterly advice. Walk away, don't dig. You have no idea what you're messing with. I paused at the door and looked back at her. I saw her for what she was, not just an enabler, but the architect of my mother's suffering, a smiling sociopath in a cashmere prison of her own making. I didn't say a word. I held her gaze for a long, silent moment, letting her wonder what was behind my eyes. Then I turned, walked out the front door, and closed it quietly behind me. As I got back into my SUV, I looked at the bag of my mother's belongings on the passenger seat, then thought of the video file, safe and secure in the cloud. I had just walked into the lion's den, and the lioness had no idea I was carrying a loaded gun. The fight was just beginning. I drove away from the house with Morgan's veiled threat echoing in my ears, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. She wasn't just cruel, she was confident, protected by a fortress of wealth and influence. When I got back to the Pineview Inn, the stale air in the room felt heavy with anxiety. My mother was awake. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, looking small and lost against the cheap, patterned headboard. Her eyes, red-rimmed and fearful, darted toward the door when I entered. A small, sad smile touched her lips when she saw the bag in my hand. "Oh, Liam," she whispered, her voice thick with shame. "You didn't have to." "Of course I did. I said, placing the bag on the bed beside her. You need your things. I took out her medication and a glass of water from the bathroom and handed them to her. She took her pills dutifully, her hands trembling slightly. For a few minutes we existed in a fragile truce, a son taking care of his mother. But as she pulled on one of her familiar sweaters, the illusion shattered. We can't stay here, she said, her voice dropping, her eyes flicking toward the door as if Caleb himself might burst through it. He'll be so angry, Liam. He knows I'm gone. We should go back. I can apologize. I'll tell him I was confused. He'll forgive me if I just sign the papers. I stared at her, my frustration warring with a deep, aching pity. Mom, listen to me. You are not going back there, and you are not signing anything. You don't understand, she insisted, her voice rising with panic. He has everyone on his side. The lawyers, the bankers, everyone. You're making it worse. We're poking a bear, Liam. He hurt you, Mom, I said, my voice low and intense. That's the only thing that matters. Before she could argue further, I decided to shift my focus. Arguing was pointless. I needed a plan. I needed a lawyer, a real one, not some shark like Grimaldi. I sat down on the other bed, opened my laptop, and powered it on. My first priority was to organize my evidence. I created a new folder, dragging the photos from my phone of the erased family pictures, and I started a document, typing out a timeline of everything that had happened since the deputy's call. I opened the video file, Evidence 01, just to confirm it was still there, its horrifying clarity a stark reminder of what was at stake. And that's when it happened. The cursor on my screen started to move on its own. It drifted across my desktop with an eerie, unnatural smoothness. I snatched my hand back from the trackpad, as if I'd been burned. It had to be a glitch, but then the cursor clicked, opening a folder. Then another. It was moving with purpose, fast and efficient. My blood ran cold. I was being watched. Before I could even react, a black command window flashed open on the screen, lines of green text scrolling by faster than I could read. My files, my photos, my timeline, my video were highlighted, one by one, and in the blink of an eye, they vanished. Poof. Sent to the trash bin, which was then immediately and permanently emptied. No, 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 I muttered, grabbing the laptop, fumbling to disconnect it from the motel's Wi-Fi. But it was too late. A single plain text file appeared in the center of my now empty desktop. I clicked on it. It contained 2 words. Stop digging. Then the screen went black. A strangled sound escaped my throat. My mother looked over, her face pale with alarm. Liam, what is it? What's wrong? I didn't answer. I frantically tried to reboot the machine, my heart hammering against my ribs. When it finally came back to life, it was to a generic startup screen, asking me to select a language. The entire hard drive had been wiped clean. Everything was gone. My cloud server I logged in with my phone, my hands shaking. The folder was empty. The backup was gone too. They had breached everything. They hadn't just punched a hole in my defenses. They had burned the entire fortress to the ground. A wave of pure, unadulterated panic washed over me. The bear my mother had warned me about wasn't just awake. It was in my room, and it had ripped the throat out of my case. But as the panic crested, something else took its place. A cold, hard resolve. They thought they had erased me. They thought they had won. I stood up and walked over to my coat, which I had tossed on a chair. I reached into the inner pocket, and my fingers closed around a small, rectangular piece of plastic and metal. The backup hard drive. The second copy I had made on pure, paranoid instinct. They were good, but I was better. They had attacked me, violated my privacy, and tried to silence me. And in doing so, they had made the single biggest mistake of their lives. They had turned this from a rescue mission into a war. And I knew I couldn't fight it alone anymore. I needed someone who could fight them in the shadows they lived in. I needed Finn. I stood in the middle of that suffocatingly small motel room, the cold, smooth weight of the backup hard drive in my palm. It was the only thing left. One tiny, fragile piece of the truth in a war where the other side had just demonstrated their ability to digitally scorch the earth. My mother's warning about poking a bear echoed in my ears. She was wrong. This wasn't a bear. It was a serpent, and it operated in a world of code and firewalls I knew nothing about. I was a filmmaker. I fought with light and stories. I was bringing a camera to a gunfight. There was only one person I knew who could level the playing field. The thought of making the call filled me with a familiar mix of hope and shame. Finn and I hadn't spoken in 3 years, not since a bitter argument over something stupid that neither of us had been willing to apologize for. But 10 years ago, in the ivy-covered halls of our university, he had been my closest friend. I was the idealistic film student, and he was the punk rock computer science prodigy who saw code as poetry. Our friendship was forged the year he was nearly expelled. He'd hacked the university's administrative server not to steal or cause damage, but to expose a pay-for-grades scheme involving wealthy donor families. The administration was going to crucify him to cover it up. I spent 2 weeks living on coffee and adrenaline, using my camera to interview students and follow the money trail until I had enough evidence for a short, explosive documentary that I released on campus forums. The scandal blew up, the administration backed down, and Finn got to graduate. I had saved his future. He'd never forgotten it. I pulled out my phone, found his number, and pressed call before I could lose my nerve. He picked up on the third ring. "Well, look what the cat dragged in." His voice was the same, a dry, cynical drawl. "To what do I owe the honor, Connor? Finally decide to trade in that camera for a real job?" "Finn, I need your help," I said, cutting straight to it. There was no time for pleasantries. "I'm in trouble. Big trouble." I gave him the 30-second version, the abuse, the financial documents, the video evidence, and the remote wipe of my entire digital life. I told him I was in a motel in Clackamas County with my mother, and one last copy of the video that could burn my brother to the ground. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint click of a keyboard. "So, the golden boy finally showed his true colors," Finn said, his voice losing its sarcastic edge, replaced by something colder. "And he hired pros to clean it up. Wiping a local drive and a cloud backup simultaneously isn't amateur hour." He paused again. "Don't connect that hard drive to anything. Don't even look at it. Where are you?" "The Pineview Inn, off I-84, I told him. Pathetic. "I'll be there in an hour," he said. "And Liam, don't offer to pay me. You couldn't afford my rates anyway." He hung up. True to his word, 58 minutes later, there was a sharp knock on the door. I opened it to find Finn looking older, sharper, but fundamentally the same. He was dressed in a worn leather jacket, his hair was a mess, and he was carrying a heavy-duty Pelican case that looked like it could survive a bomb blast. He walked in, gave my mother a soft, sympathetic nod, and didn't waste a second. "Let's see what these bastards did," he said, opening his case on the small table. It wasn't a laptop. It was a custom-built rig, a web of wires and processors that he booted up with a few keystrokes. He took the hard drive from me with an almost surgical reverence and plugged it into his machine. "Okay, first things first," he said, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "I'm making 3 encrypted, geographically isolated copies of this video. One in a server bank in Iceland, one in Switzerland, and one on a private server I own that only I can access. They can't touch this again, ever." As he worked, he had me recount every detail of the hack. The message: "Stop digging, arrogant." They left a digital fingerprint, a shred of code in the boot sector of your machine's corpse. "I can trace it. It'll take time, but I'll find out who they hired." He worked in silence for a few minutes, his eyes scanning lines of code. Then he stopped. "You mentioned a napkin. Grimaldi Law, Trust Amendment." I nodded. "I just ran a search," Finn said, pointing to his screen. "Grimaldi Law is a boutique firm in Portland. Very discreet, very expensive. But their web server? It's hosted on the same IP block as a dozen shell corporations, all of which are owned by one parent company, Thorn Development." He turned to look at me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something that looked like a hunter's grin. "Your brother isn't just trying to steal your mother's house, Liam. He's swimming with sharks, and it looks like they got sloppy." He had just handed me a new thread. The serpent had a name. And for the first time since that phone call ripped my life apart, I felt a surge of something I hadn't felt in days, but hope. We were no longer hiding, we were fighting back. The motel room, which had been a cage of fear and frustration, was now a humming command center. For the next 2 days, Finn worked with a relentless, feverish energy while I focused on my mother. We moved her to a safer, more comfortable extended-stay hotel in a quiet Portland suburb, a place with a kitchenette and sunlight, giving her a small semblance of normalcy. She was still fragile, still haunted, but the immediate terror had begun to recede, replaced by a deep, weary sadness. She didn't ask about my plans, and I didn't offer any details. It was an unspoken agreement. She wasn't ready to face the truth, and I needed to protect her from the fight to come. Every few hours, my phone would buzz with an update from Finn. He had peeled back the layers of Caleb's financial dealings, and the picture he painted was uglier than I could have imagined. The trust amendment was the linchpin. It was a complex legal document, drafted by Grimaldi Law, that effectively gave Caleb power of attorney over my mother's estate, including her house and savings, citing her potential future incompetence. He had used this power to transfer her primary asset, the family home, valued at over $1 million, to a shell corporation for the grand sum of $1. That shell corporation was a subsidiary of Thorn Development. Marcus Thorn was a notoriously ruthless Portland developer with a reputation for bulldozing historic neighborhoods for luxury condos. Caleb hadn't just stolen from our mother. He'd sold her entire history to the highest bidder to finance his next big project. Thorn is the weak link, Finn explained over the phone, his voice sharp with focus. I've been monitoring his digital footprint. He's arrogant, he brags on social media, and he's hosting a private investors meeting tonight at the Astoria Club downtown. He's a peacock, Liam, and peacocks like to show their feathers. A plan began to form, a risky, audacious strategy that felt like something straight out of a movie. I was, after all, a filmmaker. It was time I started directing. I dug out the tailored blazer and dark jeans I kept in my car for client meetings, transforming myself from the worried son into what I hoped would pass for a bored Seattle tech investor. Finn created a plausible digital backstory for me, complete with a LinkedIn profile for a fake startup, and gave me my target. Just get him talking about his acquisition strategies, Finn advised. Guys like Thorn don't see fraud, they see creative financing. The Astoria Club was a den of quiet, obscene wealth. Dark wood, supple leather, and the low murmur of powerful men cutting deals over glasses of scotch that cost more than my rent. Marcus Thorn was exactly as I'd pictured him. Slicked back hair, a deep artificial tan, and a gold watch that gleamed under the dim lights. He was holding court in a corner booth, his laughter loud and obnoxious. I ordered a whiskey at the bar, waiting for my moment. Armed with the intel from Finn, I knew Thorn was trying to court an investor from a Seattle firm I had a passing acquaintance with. That was my way in. I walked over, feigning a mild, confident surprise. Marcus Thorn? I'm Liam. I believe we have a mutual friend, David Chen, at Olympia Capital. Thorn's eyes flickered with recognition. The bait was taken. I spent the next 20 minutes playing the part, talking about market trends and investment opportunities, flattering his ego, praising his visionary work in the Pearl District. I had a high-fidelity micro-recorder in my breast pocket, its microphone disguised as a simple pen. The real challenge, I said, leaning in conspiratorially after he'd had his third Macallan, is acquisition. Sourcing properties before they even hit the market. I've heard you're a master at unlocking complicated assets. Thorn's chest puffed out. He loved this. It's an art form, he slurred, a smug grin on his face. You can't be afraid to get your hands dirty. Amateurs wait for a for sale sign. Professionals create the sale. How so? I asked, keeping my voice casual. He leaned closer, his breath heavy with whiskey. Take a recent deal. A prime property, family-owned for generations. The matriarch was getting on, a real sentimental old bird. The son, the smart one, knew she'd never sell. So, you get the right legal framework in place. A trust, power of attorney. You leverage her love for her son against her attachment to the house. He chuckled, a low, ugly sound. You make signing the papers an act of love. You tell her it's to protect her from probate, from taxes. You use words she trusts. He took a long swallow of his drink, his eyes gleaming. The beauty is, it's all ironclad. The old lady signs a paper she doesn't understand. The son gets his inheritance early, liquidates the asset to me for a fraction of its value, and I get a lot cleared for a 30-story high-rise. Everybody wins. My entire body went cold. He had just confessed. He had laid out the entire criminal conspiracy as if it were a brilliant case study in a business school textbook. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it, but I forced a smile. Brilliant, I said, shaking my head in mock admiration. Absolutely brilliant. I stayed for another 10 minutes, making polite conversation before excusing myself. I walked out of the club's heavy oak doors and into the cold night air, my hand pressed against my chest, feeling the solid weight of the pen in my pocket. The predator had shown his feathers. and I had recorded every single word. The video showed the violence. And now, I had a confession for the motive. The trap was almost set. The air in my new motel room crackled with a strange electric energy. I played the audio from the pen recorder, and Finn listened intently, a grim smile spreading across his face as Marcus Thorne's drunken, boastful voice filled the small room. When the recording finished with Thorne's damning line, "Everybody wins," Finn just shook his head, a look of almost artistic appreciation on his face. "He didn't just give you a confession, Liam," he said, leaning back in his chair. "He gift-wrapped his own indictment and tied a bow on it. The man is a walking, talking liability. My part was done. I had the video of the assault and the audio of the motive. The question was, what now? We take this to the police," I said, my first instinct kicking in, "and we find a lawyer who can fight Grimaldi." Finn held up a hand. "Slow down. You do that, and you're fighting on their turf. Thorne and your brother have an army of lawyers. They'll file motions, they'll demand injunctions, they'll bury you in paperwork and legal fees for the next 5 years. They'll paint you as the bitter, jealous brother seeking revenge. By the time this ever sees a courtroom, they'll have spun the narrative a dozen different ways. We have a nuke. You don't ask a nuke for a polite conversation. You detonate it." He was right. They had built their empire in the court of public opinion, hiding their rot behind a flawless facade of charity galas and family values. So that's where we had to tear them down. Finn brought up a website on his laptop. It was an independent investigative journal, a Substack newsletter called The Gilded Cage, run by a journalist named Alina Reyes. She was a legend, a 2-time Pulitzer winner who had left a major newspaper to go independent, and she specialized in one thing: exposing the corruption of the rich and powerful. She was untouchable, feared, and meticulously fact-checked. "We don't leak this to a gossip blog," Finn said, his eyes gleaming with strategic intensity. "We give it to a titan." For the next hour, I became a filmmaker again. I sat at my new, secured laptop aloner from Finn, and I edited. I took the most damning seconds of the video, the sharp, ugly sound of the slap, my mother's cry, and Morgan's cold, calculated adjustment of the camera. I intercut it with the crystal-clear audio of Marcus Thorne bragging about how to creatively steal a house from an old woman. I bookended the piece with a simple, stark white text on a black screen. It began with, "This is Evelyn Connor. She is a retired librarian, a grandmother, and a mother." And it ended with Thorne's voice over a beautiful, sun-drenched photo of the family home. Everybody wins. The entire package was less than 60 seconds long. It was brutal, undeniable, and devastating. I drafted a short, anonymous email to the encrypted address on Alina Reyes's site. I attached the video file, a transcript of the full audio recording, and a link to Thorne Development's latest project, which was, of course, a luxury high-rise. The subject line was simple: the price of a Portland high. Rise. I hovered my finger over the send button, my heart pounding. This was the point of no return. I looked at Finn. He just nodded. I clicked send. For the rest of the night, we waited. The silence was agonizing. Then, at 7 a.m. the next morning, my phone buzzed. It was a notification from a social media account I followed for Alina Reyes. Her post read, "I have reviewed evidence of a crime that is so morally bankrupt it has shaken me to my core. To the son who sent it, thank you for your courage. My report drops at 9 a.m. Portland, get ready to be angry." 2 hours later, the world exploded. Alina's article was a masterpiece of controlled fury. It laid out the facts, embedded our video package at the top, and linked to Caleb and Morgan's Family Foundation website. Within minutes, the story was everywhere. The hashtag Finn had suggested in the anonymous email number, #UnsilenceEvelyn, began to trend. First locally in Portland, then regionally, then nationally. The video, ripped from the article, was rocketing across every social media platform, viewed hundreds of thousands of times an hour. I watched in stunned silence as the digital inferno we had lit began to burn. The comments on Caleb's real estate page, once filled with praise, were now a torrent of fury. Morgan's Charity Foundation website crashed from the traffic. Local news stations were running segments, playing the blurred video and the damning audio. They had spent a lifetime curating a perfect image, and we had destroyed it in a single morning. The power had shifted so completely, so seismically, it almost didn't feel real. They were trapped in a prison of their own making, their own camera, and their own words now the bars of their cage. I looked over at my mother, who was sitting in the small kitchenette, quietly reading a book, blissfully unaware of the storm raging outside in her name. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, I knew we were going to win. Then, my phone rang, the screen flashing with an unknown number. I answered, my heart skipping a beat. "Is this Liam Connor?" a man's stern voice asked. "This is Detective Harding with the Portland Police Bureau. We've seen the Alina Reyes report. Sir, we need you to come down to the precinct and make a formal statement." The days between the story breaking and the court date were a blur of sterile offices and hushed, strategic conversations. I gave my statement to Detective Harding, a grim-faced veteran who had seen it all and wasn't the least bit surprised by the depravity of the wealthy. On Finn's recommendation, I hired a lawyer named Sarah Jenkins. She was a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her 50s who specialized in elder abuse cases, and she had an air of quiet fury that I immediately trusted. We met in her small, book-lined office, and I told her everything, finally handing over the last physical copy of the evidence. She listened without interruption, her expression hardening with every detail. The hardest part was telling my mother. I sat with her in the sunny kitchenette of the hotel and gently explained that the story was public, that there was going to be a hearing. I didn't show her the video, I couldn't, but I told her what was on it. She didn't cry, she just seemed to shrink, folding into herself as a profound, hollowed-out grief washed over her. "All I ever did was love him," she whispered, and that simple, heartbreaking sentence was an indictment of everything Caleb had done. She was terrified of facing him, but with Sarah's gentle encouragement, she agreed it was something she had to do. The day of the hearing for the emergency protective order, the courthouse was a zoo. Reporters and news vans clogged the street outside, a direct result of the storm we had unleashed. We were escorted in through a side door, a strange inversion of a celebrity entrance. When we walked into the hearing room, the air was thick with tension. Caleb and Morgan were already there, sitting at the respondents' table. They looked pale and exhausted, but they were dressed in impeccable, expensive suits, attempting to project an aura of wronged dignity. Their lawyer was a caricature of a corporate shark, with a slick suit and a condescending smirk. He went first, his voice dripping with theatrical sincerity. He painted a picture of my brother as a devoted son, burdened by a confused and unwell mother, and harassed by a long-estranged, vindictive younger brother seeking to exploit a family tragedy for personal fame. He called the video a deceptively edited snippet, taken completely out of context during a moment of immense family stress. He was good, I had to admit. He was weaving a narrative that, without the full evidence, sounded dangerously plausible. Then it was Sarah's turn. She stood up, calm and methodical. "Your Honor," she began, her voice cutting through the room, "we believe the context is everything." She didn't start with the video. She started with the neighbors. She called an elderly woman who had lived next door to my mother for 40 years, Mrs. Henderson testified in a shaky but firm voice about hearing violent arguments, about seeing my mother with bruises on her arms she'd dismiss as clumsiness, and about a growing sense of isolation as Caleb and Morgan restricted her access to old friends. A pattern of control and abuse began to emerge. Then, Sarah turned to the video. "My opponent claims this video is deceptively edited," she said, her voice ringing with contempt. "So let's see the unedited, time-stamped raw file, shall we?" The screen in the courtroom flickered to life. The scene from that night played out in excruciating detail. The argument, the slap, its sound sharp and brutal in the silent room, my mother's cry, and then the moment that made the entire gallery gasp. Morgan, stepping forward with cold indifference to adjust the camera, perfecting the shot. Caleb's face went ashen. His lawyer's smirk finally vanished. "He also claims this is a family matter, not a financial one," Sarah continued, relentless. "So let's hear from my client's business partner." She played the audio from my pen recorder. Marcus Thorne's drunken, bragging voice filled the room, laying out the entire scheme of trusts and shell corporations. The old lady signs a paper she doesn't understand. Everybody wins. Reporters were scribbling furiously. Caleb's lawyer was on his feet, shouting objections, but the judge, a stern-faced woman with eyes that missed nothing, waved him silent. Finally, the judge looked at my mother. "Mrs. Connor," she said, her voice surprisingly gentle, "is there anything you would like to say?" All eyes went to her. She looked so small. She took a breath, and with my hand on her shoulder, she stood. Her voice trembled, but it was clear, and it carried through the silent room. For a very long time, she said, looking directly at Caleb, I believed the pain was my fault. I told myself I deserved it. She paused, her gaze unwavering. But that thing I just saw on the screen, that horrible moment, that was not my fault. Her voice grew stronger. My son hurt me. He betrayed me. And he cannot be allowed to do it again. That was it. The judge had heard enough. She looked down at Caleb and Morgan, her face a mask of cold fury. I have seen and heard evidence today of a cruelty that is not only illegal, but is a profound betrayal of the most basic tenets of human decency. The gavel came down with a crack that sounded like a gunshot. Emergency and permanent restraining order is granted. Temporary guardianship of Evelyn Connor is granted to her son, Liam Connor. And I am referring this entire sordid affair, the assault, the clear conspiracy to defraud, to the district attorney's office for immediate criminal investigation. The room erupted. Caleb sat motionless, utterly broken. Morgan finally cracked, her perfect composure shattering as she dropped her head into her hands and let out a strangled sob. I wrapped my arms around my mother as she wept, her tears no longer of fear, but of pure, unburdened relief. It was over. We had won. As Sarah Jenkins escorted us out through the chaos of flashing cameras, her phone rang. She listened for a moment, her eyes widening. She hung up and turned to me, her face grim. That was my contact in the DA's office. They just executed a search warrant on Caleb's and Thorne's offices. She took a deep breath. Liam, they found ledgers. Detailed records of other properties, other trusts. Your mother wasn't the first one. She was just the first one whose son fought back. The revelation about the ledgers hung in the air as Sarah Jenkins guided us through the frenzied media gauntlet outside the courthouse. The world had shrunk to a blinding chaos of flashing camera bulbs and shouted questions. All I could do was shield my mother, keeping my arm firmly around her as we pushed our way to Sarah's waiting car, the roar of the press like a physical force against us. That chaotic, roaring exit was the last moment of the storm. What followed in the weeks to come was the strange, quiet aftermath, where the thunder had been replaced by the steady drumbeat of news alerts on my phone. The fallout was swift and total. The bomb we had detonated online, reinforced by the judge's ruling and the DA's investigation, created a crater from which my brother and his wife could not escape. Caleb and Marcus Thorne were arrested 2 days after the hearing. Their mugshots, stripped of all arrogance and prestige, were plastered across every news site. Morgan, in a desperate act of self-preservation, filed for divorce and issued a statement claiming she was a victim of her husband's deceit. But the video of her adjusting the camera told a different story. She was charged as a co-conspirator. The Connor Family Foundation dissolved in a firestorm of scandal, its name forever linked to elder abuse and fraud. As the story of the ledgers broke, other families, other victims began to come forward, their stories eerily similar to my mother's. Number Unsilence Evelyn became a rallying cry for a massive class action lawsuit. The gilded cage Caleb and Morgan had built for themselves had become their very real prison. Amid the legal wreckage, my most important fight was for my niece. With her parents facing years of prison time, Chloe was lost in the shuffle of social services. With Sarah's help, I filed for emergency guardianship. I stood in a quiet courtroom, this one devoid of reporters, and promised a judge I would provide a safe and stable home for the little girl who had only ever known a cold and transactional one. It was granted. I was no longer just a son. I was a guardian, responsible for this quiet, watchful child who had seen far too much. We couldn't stay in a hotel forever. We needed a home. I found a small, unassuming rented house on a tree-lined street in a quiet Portland suburb. It had a little backyard with a patchy lawn and a sturdy oak tree. It wasn't grand or impressive, but it was safe, and light poured through the kitchen windows in the morning. The three of us moved in with a few suitcases and the contents of my Seattle apartment. For the first week, we moved around each other like ghosts, the silence in the small house heavy with unspoken trauma. But slowly, tentatively, life began to seep back in. The first sign was the smell of onions and garlic sautéing in a pan. I walked into the kitchen to find my mother, her face soft with concentration, making a simple tomato sauce from a recipe she hadn't used in years. It was a small thing, but it was the first time since that night at the rest stop that I'd seen her create something instead of just survive. Then there was Chloe. For days, she barely spoke, communicating mostly through shrugs and nods. Then one afternoon, she came to me in the living room where I was working and handed me a piece of paper. It was a drawing, done in crayon. It showed three stick figures standing under a bright yellow sundae. A tall one she labeled Liam, a smaller one with gray, curly hair she labeled Grandma Ev, and the smallest one, holding both their hands, she labeled me. There were no other figures in the picture. I felt a lump form in my throat. I taped the drawing to the refrigerator, our first piece of art in our new home. One Saturday morning, I sat on the back steps with a mug of coffee, watching them. My mother and my niece, their heads close together, were kneeling in the thawing earth of the small garden bed, planting daffodil bulbs. Their hands were covered in dirt, and a genuine, unforced smile was on my mother's face as she showed Chloe how to place the bulbs in the soil. The storm had passed, the news cycle would move on, the legal battles would eventually end. But this quiet, hopeful, fragile moment was what we had been fighting for. It wasn't a triumphant cinematic victory. It was a quiet sort of dawn, and for the first time in a very long time, it felt like we were finally stepping into the light. Spring arrived in Portland not as a gentle suggestion, but as a vibrant, defiant explosion of life. The skeletal, ice-encased trees that had haunted my drive down were now bursting with green, and the air, which had been so sharp and cruel, was now soft and smelled of damp earth and blossoms. The change was most visible in our own small backyard. The daffodil bulbs, which my mother and Chloe had planted in the cold, hard ground weeks ago, had pushed their way through the soil. They stood in a cheerful, unruly line along the fence, their bright yellow heads turned toward the sundae. They were a stubborn, beautiful promise that had been kept. Our house had become a home. The rooms were filled with the comfortable clutter of everyday life. Chloe's drawings on the fridge, my mother's books stacked on the end tables, the sound of cartoons on a Saturday morning. The quiet was no longer heavy, it was peaceful. One afternoon, while helping my mother unpack the last of the boxes I'd retrieved from the old house, I found an old hardcover copy of her favorite book. Tucked inside the pages was a sealed envelope with my name on it, written in her familiar, elegant script. I knew from the faded ink that it was old. I sat down on the floor and opened it. The letter inside was dated 3 weeks before the night I'd driven down to save her. She had written it, but she had never found the courage to send it. "My dearest Liam," it began, "I am writing this because I am a coward, and it is easier to write these words than to speak them. For years, I have watched you build a life of integrity, a life where you stand for the truth, and I have met your courage with my own fear. I see the man your brother is becoming. I see the hardness in his eyes, the coldness that I have tried to pretend is just ambition. And I see how I have failed you. A mother is supposed to protect both her children. But somewhere along the way, I convinced myself that my duty was to protect the weaker son, the one who needed my excuses and my silence to survive. I failed to see that you were the stronger son, the one who deserved my respect. I chose to be a shield for his cruelty instead of a champion for your goodness. It is the greatest regret of my life. Forgive me for being so blind for so long." I folded the letter, the paper soft and worn in my hands. The apology I had longed for, the acknowledgement I never thought I'd receive, was right here. It was a bridge back to a past I thought had been burned to the ground. I didn't need to say anything. I walked out to the backyard where she was weeding the small garden, her face peaceful in the afternoon sunday. I just stood beside her, watching the daffodils sway in the breeze. She looked up at me and smiled, a real, genuine smile. "They came up so bright, didn't they?" "Yeah, Mom," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "They did. We both knew we weren't just talking about the flowers. My life is different now. The legal cases against Caleb, Morgan, and Thorne will stretch on for years, a distant echo of a war we have already won. My focus is here, in this house, with this strange, beautiful, and broken family we have built from the wreckage. I set up my editing equipment in the small spare bedroom, and I have started working on a new project. On a large whiteboard, I've pinned photos, documents, and notes. I'm working with Alina Reyes. We're producing a full-length documentary, not just about my mother, but about all the other victims whose lives were shattered by Thorne and my brother. We're giving them a voice. The story that began with a single, desperate phone call has become my life's work. Family, I've learned, is not an obligation. It's not about the blood you share. It's about the people who show up when the storm hits. It's the people who help you plant bulbs in the frozen ground, who draw you into their pictures, who write the words they're too scared to say. And justice isn't just about watching the guilty fall. It's about what you build afterward, what you choose to let grow in the space they leave behind. If you are listening to this, if you have been in a place of darkness and silence, please know this. Your story matters. Your voice has power. The first step out of the shadows is always the hardest, but it is never, ever taken alone. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. And thank you for helping us prove that even after the coldest winter, the light always, always returns.